Hello and welcome to the Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Troy Glover. Tonight we're going to be kicking off a provincial pot puree or cannabis having to do with New Brunswick, and as well some federal election topics. And for that we have Kris, leader of the People's Alliance of New Brunswick. Thanks for coming in with us tonight.
Good to be here, Troy. How are you?
I'm very good.
Good.
Now, off the top of the show now, did you want to say a few words about the passing of provincial MLA Greg Thompson?
Yeah, for sure. Mr. Thompson was certainly a hard worker for his area. He's got a legacy of being in public service. He served the people, I think, quite well federally and provincially. Of course, he didn't have the health in the last little bit to put as much into it, I'm sure, as he would have liked. But I remember the first time I met him, I guess officially in the legislature. Our seats were next to each other, so he was kind of my neighbor across the aisle. And I remember the first thing he said to me, he said, we're friends that are just a sword's length away from each other. And he always had a pretty good sense of humor, and I certainly send my condolences to his family and friends.
Now, kicking off today's first topic, Kris, in its first year, Cannabis MB is seeing to fall short of about $25 million of its projected sales goal that it was supposed to reach for this year. What exactly happened?
Well, I mean, government's the only entity that I'm aware of that could lose money selling marijuana, for starters. But yeah, I mean, we knew really once marijuana became legal, the federal government legalized marijuana, our automatic response after doing a little bit of research on it and getting some idea around how government would roll it out, we felt from the start it needs to be privatized. I'm one of those people that firmly believe that government shouldn't be in the business of selling much of anything. I mean, government should be providing services to the people, collecting reasonable taxes and providing things like infrastructure, healthcare, education. Why government is in the business of selling marijuana just blows my mind. And that's why you have losses. You've got these big, elaborate stores. The leases that they're paying on these stores is just absurd. And then on top of that, you have a shortage of supply. You've got high prices. Resulted in layoffs at Cannabis NB. The whole thing is just a complete debacle. I'm disappointed that the previous Liberal government would have such a setup, but I'm getting equally disappointed with the current government that they're not moving on this. I mean, they put out three options. They said, we'll either keep it the way it is, privatize it, or turn it over to one kind of private sector company, and so that they have a monopoly on it. But I oppose that as well. I think with something like this, it has to be given to the private sector, as a whole, regulate it properly, tax it fairly, and if government had did that in the start, if government had have taken this and just allowed the private sector to do what the private sector does best, and again, put your regulations in as a government and just simply sit back and collect the revenue off the taxes, we would be seeing money coming into the province rather than money not, or losing money. And I want people to think about this, people that are watching this tonight. When you talk about a loss at Cannabis NB, and you talk about the setup costs, I think it was around $200 million to get all the stores set up and whatnot, and then you look at the annual loss that we're having on this based on projected sales, in essence, as taxpayers, we're subsidizing the sale of marijuana. I mean, think about that for a second. We're not talking about subsidizing daycares or subsidizing tuition. We're talking about subsidizing the retail of marijuana. It's absolutely absurd. And again, we got the government today, they're putting out three options. They're saying they're studying it and consulting. And, I'm so tired of studies and consultations. Do it. Privatize it. It's the right thing to do. It's the only way for the government to collect revenue and regulate it so it stays out of the hands of young people.
See, now, some studies have shown that even it can go up to as high as 40% of people are getting their marijuana tend to be through illegal means, not through the legal stores that have been set up through the government. Do you think through the privatization of marijuana that could have been dropped down substantially?
Without question. I mean, the reality is price matters, when it comes to anything. It's why you're seeing an uptick in illegal tobacco sales as well, right? I mean, because people are getting a lower price on the black market, and you're never going to completely eliminate that. I mean, that's the reality. And you do it legally, it's always going to be a little bit more than people buying it on the black market. But at the same time, have some moderation there, have some reasonable pricing, and I think you'd see a drop. But see, when government takes it over, you eliminate any competition in the private sector. So government sets the rate, and people won't pay it. And we're seeing it today, and government's losing money as a result. Again, why government got involved in this, it makes no sense to me. It doesn't make much sense to a lot of people I talk to. The private sector should do what the private sector does best, and government should be there to regulate it and tax it.
Now, a notable part of the previous government's budget relied on revenue from cannabis sales for its positive outlook. Now, was it dangerous to assume the best out of the gate?
Well, no. If they had done what we had requested and called for, they would have seen that revenue and more, is what we're saying. There'd be more money coming into the province, like the money that could be going to healthcare and education and informing the public on the risks of marijuana use. But instead, what we're seeing is government losing money. Taxpayers are paying some of the highest taxes in the country here in New Brunswick. And where does our tax dollars go? To sell marijuana. Crazy.
Now, to your knowledge, did the Higgs government make changes to the budget to compensate for the lack of sales earlier this year?
Well, the government received a little more of a windfall from the federal transfers. It's important to keep in mind, to see that surplus. And look, I am proud to be part, in some small way, of having balanced books here in the province. I mean, we voted in favor of the budget in the last sitting, last fall. And it's the first time in over a decade that New Brunswick has seen a surplus, and we were able to balance the books. And I believe we had some strong input with the government on that, and we voted in favor to keep the government going and to see those balanced books. So, it's good that we have balanced books, but it's not just about balance. It's about getting revenue on one side, and on the other end, government not being involved in what government should be involved in. Government's got a lot to worry about. I mean, our healthcare system, frankly, is in crisis mode. And if anybody thinks otherwise, just go to emergency room, see how long you got to wait for a doctor. If you get scheduled for any type of procedure or appointment to a specialist, you're going to wait a long time. We're in a crisis mode in this province with healthcare. Education has a lot of challenges. Senior care is becoming incredibly difficult. So government has so much to worry about, and yet we're focusing all our attention on this foolishness of marijuana sales. And government shouldn't be having any part of it other than to regulate and tax it. Let the private sector look after it.
Now, to go more in depth, would the rules for privately run stores be the same as government-run stores? Like, how would they be different?
Well, that's something the government could set up. As far as the regulation goes and the licensing and all of that sort of thing, that's a whole different can of worms. But again, we're not reinventing the wheel here. I mean, other states in the U.S. Have already done it, so we could learn from some of those folks on how to do it best. Ultimately, there's from what I understand, two objectives. It's one, to eliminate the black market, and you're not going to do that if your prices are too high and your product's not available. And secondly, it's to keep it out of the hands of young people. Well, I think you can accomplish that through the private sector. That's where the regulations come in, and you may have it set up where there's so many licensing per region. You could have licensing fees that a store that opens up has to pay to the government. Now those fees can go to public safety to make sure they enforce the regulations that are put in place. I mean, look at it today. There's stores privately selling it in all over the province. In Fredericton, Moncton, St. John, there's marijuana stores that are popping up. I know a lot of First Nations now are getting in on it. I don't see police banging their doors down. So I mean, at the same time, just let the private sector do what the private sector does best. Make sure government has proper regulations, tax the product, and get back to what we need to get back to: healthcare, education, infrastructure, those sorts of things.
Now, going into like having the product available, like Cannabis NB has struggled with having some of their supplies not even available. So the supply chain's been cut off sometimes, meaning there was days with little to no product to sell whatsoever. How would you say a privately run sector would work differently than that?
Well, if you want to totally screw something up, just let government take a crack at it. They'll find a way to screw it up, especially when you talk about retail and sales. No, the private sector, I'm fully confident would find ways to make sure the product's available. I can tell you one thing. The guy in the street corner, he's got no problem with supply and product. He'll make sure that he meets his demand. So again, the private sector would do the same thing. It's government that gets in the way of these things. So, at the end of the day, I do believe that that government just needs to hand it over to the private sector, and the private sector, like anything else, has competition. So competition, increases supply. It keeps the prices at a good level, and and again, on the other side, it's up to government to make sure that the private sector is doing things right. And if there's a store that's selling marijuana to an underage, then they should lose their license, and you can have very strict requirements in the regulation to do that. So it's not about safety. It's not about regulation. It's just about government giving this false impression that they can do it better than the private sector, and that's just a flawed perception.
Now, how would you say that the government struggled with a sector that no one saw that could really fail?
Well, it's like I said, government's the only entity that could lose money selling marijuana. No, it's laughable. I mean, the black market's been onto this for decades. I mean, there's nothing new here. But again, it makes no sense to me. I mean, with all the things government has to worry about, cannabis just shouldn't be one of them.
Now, when it comes to some of the Cannabis NB stores, actually all of them, there's a lot of people that were hesitant to even go towards even trying to use cannabis because, as we all know, no form of smoking is ever good for you, inhaling anything in your lungs. So a lot of people were kind of more passive on using any of the Cannabis NB stores because they didn't offer edibles and all that. Do you think that maybe the sales would have been a bit different for this year if right out of the gate there were even edibles for people to choose by?
I don't think so. I don't think that would have changed much of anything, to be honest, because again, if there was a way to quantify what the black market is doing, I think you would see that the black market sales probably hasn't changed much with or without edibles, right? So, no, I don't think edibles would have solved Cannabis NB's problem at all. I think it just would have been another form of loss, with government trying to manage the sale of marijuana. So, when you talk about edibles, I mean, you're getting into a whole different ball of wax for sure. I mean, the government's going to have some real challenges, I think, in how they regulate edibles. That's a whole different thing. But it is government's responsibility to do that and to make sure, again, that you keep it out of the hands of young people. That's the key. And, for grown adults that choose to do it, then make sure it's done properly and taxed fairly and leave it be.
Now, Nova Scotia sells its cannabis in the same stores as its liquor. Why do you think our government decided not to take the same approach?
I don't know, because I frankly don't think government should be in the business of selling liquor either. I mean, that's, again, it's all in what you believe government is here for. What do you pay taxes for? What is your expectation of your elected officials? What's your expectations of your government and your opposition? And for me, government's role is, I believe in small government, I believe in low taxes, and I believe in government staying out of people's lives as much as possible, reasonably possible. I mean, obviously you have to have laws, you have to have structure and order, absolutely, that's what government's for. But I believe government overreaches when it gets into things like alcohol and marijuana and these other retail sectors as a branch of government. I think that's where government has overstepped its bounds. So, I'm not in favor of Cannabis NB going into NB liquor stores. Again, I think you're just compounding on the complexity of retail from government. So let cannabis go to the private sector.
Now, you've already stated about how we have such high prices with our Cannabis NB sector. There have been many complaints about the prices of cannabis in New Brunswick, and showing that there's lower prices elsewhere in the country as well as through illegal means. Why do you think we had such higher sticker prices for these things?
Well, from what I've read and researched, the stores themselves have been incredibly costly to get set up, and the leases to those stores is just astronomical. And I think we need to do some digging on how those leases came about. I mean, the previous government, of course, set the leases up with the owners of the buildings, the developers. But how did we get to this high cost of leasing these buildings? The square footage, the cost for square footage, and I don't know the exact number, but it's very high compared to, again, private sector competition in other industries. So that's the first question: is the cost of that. And then again, you have this supply chain that the government ran out of marijuana. I mean, the black market just laughs at this. I mean, people that have been doing this illegally for years, they shake their head. And again, it gets back to the fact government shouldn't be in that in the first place. Government should do what it can do, and what it can do is, or what it should be doing, is providing good health care. It should be providing good schools for our kids. It should be providing roads that are plowed and potholes that are filled, good infrastructure, and your basic social programs. Outside that, that's enough for government to tackle right there in and of itself.
Now, Finance Minister Ernie Steeves is putting the blame directly on the previous Gallant government. Would you agree with that statement at all?
Yes and no. I mean, it's one thing to say, you messed this up, but now you're in charge to fix it. So if you're coming out and saying, well, we're studying it and we're consulting and we're looking at every, come on, let's get real. You know it's broken, you know why it's broken, and you know the solution. The solution is to privatize. It's what we've been saying from the moment it became legal. It should not be in the hands of government in terms of sales. So the minister knows what the solution is, and we're going to push him to see that it's fully privatized.
All right. Well, for now, we actually have to be going to break here soon, so we're going to continue on with this later. Continue on with us as we continue to talk about cannabis in the province, as well as some general federal election topics. Hello, and welcome back to Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Troy Glover. Tonight we have Kris Austin, leader of the People's Alliance in New Brunswick, in with us. Tonight we're talking about cannabis in New Brunswick, as well as some general federal election topics. Now, just a few more questions before we jump into the federal election on cannabis. How long do you think the government can continue losing money on this sort of cannabis in New Brunswick until they're forced to make a move?
Well, I think government can lose money for a long time.
Yeah.
We've seen in the past where things are broken and they continue to go broken without government fixing it. So how long? As long as government so chooses. But at some point, I would hope average Joe, taxpayer, would stand up and say, this has got to be fixed. And I hope they're getting there now. I mean, the data's in, we know the numbers in terms of the first year and the first quarter. It's not good. Government says it's not good. Fix it. Do what we've been saying from day one. Privatize it. Your problems are solved. The only issue you're going to have once you privatize is how do you regulate it, what regulations you put in place, how do you license it. But again, these are not impossible questions to answer. It's been done in other places. It can be done here. Learn what other places did wrong, do it better here, find out what succeeded in other places, and mimic that here. And then again, have reasonable taxes. You don't get to tax the thing to death, but have reasonable taxes on it so you're getting revenue from it, and then wash your hands of it and move on to more important things.
Now, government-run stores seems to have placated some critics' worries about marijuana getting in the hands of children. In what ways would you say the private sector businesses could give people reassurances that this wouldn't happen?
Well, again, that's up to government regulations. You know, in terms of it getting in the hands of young people, you know, you could have, you know, a similar setup in terms of, you know, ID has to be shown.
Yeah.
Same with you go into a liquor store, right? I mean, you know, whether it's an agency store or a liquor store, you go to a gas station that has an agency store, you know, if you don't look like you're over 21, you show your ID and away you go. Yeah, you know, you can do the same thing with marijuana. The private sector can do it as long as the government has the regulations in there.
So as long as the government's making sure they're keeping a watchful eye on the private sector is what you're saying?
Absolutely. And again, if you're talking about licensing of the private sector stores, you know, whatever fees there are for those licensing, you can put that into public safety to make sure public safety is enforcing the regulations. Because it's one thing to have regulations, but it's equally important that you enforce the regulations. I've always said, if you can't, you know, reasonably enforce laws, then you shouldn't have those laws in place. So there's got to be reasonable regulations that can be enforced by public safety. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We don't need to. You just need some reasonable structure around it and fair taxes, and you know, the sky won't fall. You know, life will continue, and government will have a little extra money to put into healthcare, education, infrastructure, and things that the taxpayers expect.
All right. Now, jumping into the federal election is coming up in October. Are there any parties that the People's Alliance is particularly rooting for this election?
No, we put out a statement here a couple days ago. We're not endorsing any party or any candidate. We are encouraging people to vote. I think it's important that citizens in this province look at the platforms. You know, there's twofold in any election. You've got to look at the party as a whole. What's the party saying? What's the leader saying? But, you know, equally important to that is who is your candidate? You know, can you rely on your candidate? Are they going to be there when you need them? Are they going to fight for you? And I've always said, you know, I met several candidates from various parties, you know, chatting, and, you know, I've always said to them, you know, when it comes down to it, if it comes down to a choice between representing the people or representing your party, which are you going to do? And of course they all say they'll represent us, but you know, it's up to us to determine if that's the case, because I know for me as a voter, and when we talk about federal politics, that's basically what I am. I'm not involved in any way. I am just a voter, but I look at that, I say, you know, if I throw a vote your way, I need to know that if it ever comes down to it, that you will side with us, the voter, as opposed to the party that's trying to whip you on a vote one way or the other.
Now, do you see parallels between New Brunswick's provincial politics and the federal politics as a whole?
I don't know, but I hope so. I really genuinely hope that we can see a minority government after the results of the election. I think it's good. I think New Brunswick is quite pleased overall with the government we have here provincially. It gives everybody an option to get at the table. I mean, I look at you know, how we were able to break history here in a very meaningful way, and how that has unfolded to where we're at today. I just sat in on committees on Bill 39, the vaccination bill. We talked about the machinery and equipment taxation that MLA Lowe put forward, and I look at the committee structure, and you know, before the minority government that we have in New Brunswick, it was ruled by a majority government, which meant one power was in ultimate control. So even the committees behind the scenes that dug into these bills were all set up in a majority situation. So if you weren't part of that majority government, you didn't have much say. I mean, even the fairness of the questioning was off. But they can't do that today, because today we have a minority. So it's actually the opposition parties that have more control than the actual government when it comes to committee work. So people don't see this. I mean, average Joe, and I don't expect them to, they don't see what goes on behind the scenes. They don't see the committees and the work that's done behind when the House isn't in session. But there's lots of digging that goes into that. There's lots of questions, lots of information that comes out of those. And it is important that we have a setup like we have today, because it gives all of us an opportunity to ask some real tough questions and get to the very heartbeat of what the bill is trying to do. And I hope the same federally. I hope that Canada can come out of this with the minority situation, I think it'd be good.
Now, provincial parties often have a sister party federally that shares similar names and platforms. Do you think not having a federal presence kind of gives your party a sort of advantage here in the province?
Well, it gives us the opportunity to truly represent the will of the people. We're not beholden to any federal counterpart that's going to dictate to us what we can and can't do or what we should and shouldn't do. We're here, solely for those that elected us and to represent them as best we can and as vigorously as we can. I think it is a benefit in a sense, that we can kind of chart our own course based on the direction that people of this province want us to go.
Now, you kind of already covered this already, but I'm going to bring it up again. Now, you're asking people to get out and vote. Why do you feel this is so important for you?
Democracy is important overall. I mean, whether it's a municipal election, a provincial election, or a federal election, we even vote for health boards and that sort of thing. It's all important. Get out, cast your vote. Because you think about it, Troy, and I don't want to get too sappy here, but I mean, there's places around the world. Look at Hong Kong. Yeah. I mean, they're coming in the tens of thousands, going into the airports and the streets and peacefully trying to protest, the desire for democracy. They don't have it. And lots of Middle Eastern countries, they don't have it. All the Middle Eastern countries, say, with the exception of Israel, they're all, led by authoritative governments. So they don't have the same sort of freedoms that we take for granted here. And you think of, things like the history of our country and our world in World War II. I mean, they stormed the beaches for the very thing that we have in democracy. So yes, vote. I mean, I know it can be frustrating, and I talk to people and they say, they look at the federal landscape and say, I don't know what to do. How do I vote? And I try not to get too involved with it. I let people make up their own mind. But I said, again, look at the policies, look at your candidates, look at the track record of the parties. Don't be afraid to think outside the box. And give the independents. If there's independents that are running, give them a chance. Look at what they're saying. Don't be in a box where you have to do what you've always done. But look at it and vote. That's important.
Now, what do you say to people who look at the leaders and the parties and say that none of them really appeal to them? How do you get them to go out to vote?
Well, again, you're never going to find, well, I shouldn't say never. It's seldom that you find any party or leader or candidate that lines up 100% with your way of thinking. And again, it's all about just figuring out for yourself what's important to you and how close that party or candidate comes to the way you think. And again, you got to look at their track record too. What have the Conservatives done, what have the Liberals done, the NDP, the Greens, that sort of thing. You got to take it all in and again try to line it up with where you're at in your thinking politically, and vote. Don't look for a perfect candidate. It's not going to happen, and there's no perfect party. But try to find the one that best suits you and make your voice count.
Do you think it's important for people to also, when they're looking for a candidate, to have perspective where they're looking for someone that might do good by someone else, but where they're struggling, but not where they're struggling currently?
So can you rephrase that?
So like perspective, so someone who's looking for a candidate, instead of looking at how this candidate is going to ultimately completely 100% benefit them, they're looking at how someone who might not be is either well off as them or someone that is in a more difficult position than them, how that candidate will benefit those people.
Well, sure, and I think that sort of perspective is you're looking at the whole, not just the part. Yeah. It's one thing to say, well, for me personally, I vote for this person because he or she's going to benefit me personally. I guess some people will do that, but I think it is more important that we look at it and say what's going to benefit the country as a whole, what's going to benefit the province as a whole here in New Brunswick. The sad thing about federal politics is quite often Atlantic Canada, and New Brunswick included in that, of course, kind of gets left out. I mean, we're kind of on the tail end of federal politics just by sheer numbers. So, it is important to say, what party or what, these candidates really going to fight for Atlantic Canada, make sure our voices are heard, especially here in New Brunswick.
All right. Now, recently news broke that some members of the NDP are jumping ship to the Green Party. What are your thoughts on that?
I feel for David Kuhn on that one, I have to be honest with you. It was a debacle. I mean, Here you've got you've got all these NDP former candidates and party supporters coming, rushing to the Greens and doing this big press conference with David Kuhn and David, Mr. Kuhn, understands that he should have done better in vetting these people before they came to make sure that they're all actually want to jump ship, because turns out they didn't all want to jump ship. Mm-hmm. So I can see some embarrassment there and some backtracking that would have to happen. But to be honest with you, I think it's a wash. I don't think it's going to make any change whatsoever to how people vote. Frankly, I don't mean to be smug about it, but I could care less what Joe Smith next door to me does. I care about what I think. I care about what my candidates are proposing to me. I care about what the party's saying on a federal level. That's how I vote. Nobody's gonna sway my vote in that sense. I think it'll just be a wash in the end.
Now, with the aftermath of some information coming in the forefront after the announcement, such as some people mentioning that they did not actually jump ship, do you think this hurts the Green Party in any way?
I don't know. I mean, it may call into question, their vetting process and their ability to really make sure that it is what it is. And the old saying goes, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. But again, I got to cut Mr. Kuhn a little bit of slack. It's one of those things where maybe in the excitement of the moment he just kind of went with it. But I don't know whether it will hurt the Greens or not. Again, that's up to Green members to decide what they want to do. But I don't see this as an earth-shattering move one way or the other politically. I think it's just, it's a story for a couple of days and then we move on to something else.
All right. Now, the NDP has been struggling in the province recently, both provincially and federally as a whole. Do you think they'll have a comeback to these setbacks?
Look, if I'm being honest, I think the NDP is toast.
Yeah.
I think they're done provincially. I think federally they're in big trouble, and I think the reason is because I think the NDP has gone far too far to the left. They become very much a very predominant socialist party to the extreme, and people just look. They see smoke and mirrors when they see it. And what I found about politics is you have to be real about what you want to do, and you have to have at least a reasonable chance of being able to accomplish some of it. I don't think any party hits 100% all the time, but you got to be able to put out ideas that most of the people can at least agree to some point. But when you're putting out these wonky ideas of free this and free that, and we don't have to raise taxes and all this sort of thing, just nobody buys it, and nor should they. And I think that's been the NDP's demise. I'll tell you, Jack Layton, he's a legend. Jack Layton was a compassionate man that worked hard to bring the NDP to the forefront, and he did that. And had it not been for his illness, I think the NDP may have gone a little bit stronger. But once he passed, I sadly think that the NDP kind of passed away too.
Yeah. Now, this week, New Brunswick appointed a new Lieutenant Governor, Brenda Murphy. What can you tell our viewers about her?
I don't know her,
yeah.
To be honest. I wish her well in her new position, and it's hard for me to make any comments, but I do know it's important, that role is filled. Starting to question the timing, that it was getting a little late to appoint a new lieutenant governor, but especially in a minority situation, because I've committed with the previous lieutenant governor, and when I met with her on a couple occasions, I said, look, I've committed to the 18 months at least. And I stand by that commitment within reason. But again, you don't know when the trigger is going to be pulled on an election. So you need a lieutenant governor, not just for an election, but also for bills. Make sure bills are signed and can move forward. They do play an important part. And I wish her well in her new job.
Now, she's walking into a continuing minority government situation. It's like, do you think for her position she has her work cut out for her?
Yeah, lieutenant governors they play an important role, but they're largely symbolic too. Her role is going to be obviously to get to a lot of events, get to host different events at the government house, that make sure that there's organizations that are that have her ear and her presence. So it's really strongly symbolic. But it does, again, play a part in the functioning of government as well.
Now, the current government has been in place for nearly a year now. How would you describe the working relationships between the four elected parties so far?
Well, I think pretty good. I don't want to speak for the Liberals or the Greens, but I made a conscious effort early on after the election to support the PC government within reason. It gets frustrating for me because there's so much more I want to see done, and if I can have any criticism of the government, it's that they move very slow, and they're not making bold moves. They're tinkering, they're tweaking things within the province. And New Brunswick doesn't need tinkering, and it doesn't need tweaking. New Brunswick needs serious reform, transformational reform. And I've been pushing them on a lot of things, tax reform, and eliminating the double tax, making sure that municipalities have some authority of taxation so that taxes for residents...
Sorry, we have to cut in there. Unfortunately, we have to cut to break.
Sure. Okay.
So continue on with us as we continue to talk about politics in New Brunswick. Hello, and welcome back to Voice of the Province. I'm your host, Troy Glover. Tonight we have Kris, leader of the People's Alliance of New Brunswick, with us. And tonight we're talking about, so far, cannabis in New Brunswick, as well as the federal election and some political matters having to do in New Brunswick. Now, did you want to continue on what you were saying before I cut you off?
Yeah, no, we were just discussing, the makeup of the legislature today and how it's gone over the last year. And I was saying, we made the conscious decision early on that we're going to support the PC government within reason for 18 months. Because I'm of the opinion I can get more done and have a little more input sitting at the table rather than sitting in opposition on the other side of the aisle. And again, with that said, we have made some accomplishments that we're proud of. We've made some changes to the Motor Vehicle Act. Again, we've seen, for the first time in over a decade, balanced books with a surplus. We all played part in that. We've seen a slight reduction on glyphosate spraying on MB power lines. So we're seeing some things getting done. The paramedics is another big issue where we're seeing now, for the first time, unilingual paramedics getting permanent full-time work. Now, I will say there's a lot more to be done on that file. You still get the advanced care paramedics that we have to look at, and I still think that there is some unreasonable language requirements around advanced care paramedics. I'm losing faith every day in Medavie and how they operate and manage Ambulance New Brunswick. I think that really needs to be looked at. But we've made some progress. And again, we were part of the progress as opposed to being in opposition and not getting anything done. So, that is good. But I urge government, and I've talked to the Premier about this and the ministers before, be bold, make bold moves. Government has to do it. New Brunswick needs it. We can't tinker our way into success and prosperity. So, we're pushing and pushing and pushing. And again, I committed to the 18 months, and beyond that, we've got to see some action.
Now, with the unfortunate news this week with Greg Thompson's passing, it alters the numbers on the floor of the legislature. Now, between now and the by-election that's to be had, does it destabilize the current government at all?
No, it really doesn't, because you also got to look at the other side. The former Premier Brian Gallant has resigned as well, so there'll be another by-election in that seat. So it kind of, I guess you could say, balances each other out in a certain way. Now, my understanding is the Premier has 6 months before he can call those by-elections. So I don't know what his thinking is there. I mean, I would hope, just out of being cordial with people in New Brunswick, he'd wait till after the federal election, which I'm sure he will. But at some point in 6 months, he's going to have to call those by-elections and then let the voters decide again. But as far as the makeup of the House, we go back in November based on the government schedule. So I don't see much change there, no.
Now, do you think Liberal leader Kevin Vickers will run in Gallant's now vacant position?
I would bet my car on it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, strategically, you have probably one of the safest Liberal ridings in the province. It's no coincidence that it was Mr. Gallant that resigned. I would be shocked if Mr. Vickers doesn't run there. Guess at the end it'll be his choice, yeah.
Now, many politicians, upon retiring, usually take advisory jobs or hop onto corporate boards. Does this say anything about their time in office, or do you think this is just a next logical step for a seasoned MLA or premier?
Well, I've never, had any negative thoughts, I guess, or ideas toward people that are in public office, that leave public office and go on to the private sector in whatever form. A lot of them do. I know some of them go into things like real estate. Some of them go into some consulting businesses. Where I do get a little bit concerned is when you see people, that are elected, that leave office, and then come back as some type of branch of the current government, especially when they have party ties to the government in place. And the reason is because I just want to be certain that the processes that are in place and the policies and the regulations that government has for everybody, that they're not bypassed because someone now who was once in office is in the private sector is pulling strings for them. So as long as everything's above board, I mean, they got to move on with their life in some way. They've got to, I suppose, continue to live and whatnot. So that's their choice.
Now, Miramichi MLA Michelle Conroy wrote a letter to the Premier expressing the concerns of her and others are having over herbicide spraying in the province. Can you talk a bit about what was in that letter?
Yeah, well, it's basically what we've been saying all through the campaign, what we continue to say today. We have very serious issues with glyphosate spraying on Crown land. There's questionable effects. There is, you've got Health Canada, which on one hand will say it's perfectly safe as long as you follow the guidelines. But then you've got other researchers that say not so much. There's issues with this. You can look at the United States where there's litigation going on where there's been court cases that have been won by people who claim to have cancer because of it. So, there's a lot to weigh there. It's not a cut and dry issue, but I know our position has been, to ban glyphosate spraying. We continue to call for that. And again, we had some input with the government and the minister. I think he did the right thing by reducing it on NB power lines. It's a start. And we're looking at the other side too. It's not just about, banning glyphosate, which we, have called for and support, but it's about the jobs that can come out of it. I mean, if you've got people out there with thinning saws like they used to do, there's going to be some more work. And, it's good for the economy, and we think it's good for the environment and public health.
Now, there's been a 30% reduction in spraying in just this year alone, but it hasn't seemed to alleviate some people's concerns when it comes to it. Do you think that spraying in New Brunswick is an all or nothing issue, where it's either it continues to happen a little bit or it just has to go away completely?
Well, we've called for a ban on it.
Yeah.
So, our position is, and when I say a ban, I'm talking about a ban on Crown land. Mm-hmm. What people do on their private land is, for the most part, their choice. And you talk about agriculture. What people need to understand, you've got potato fields out there which are sprayed with this stuff.
Yeah.
So we're not going there unless, there's something damning in the future that, tells us something's got to be done on that side. But my take on this, and our party stance is, the forest is owned by the people of the province. It's not owned by industry, unless industry owns certain sections of it, but the forest as a whole belongs to the people. And if the people overwhelmingly, and they are, saying they don't want this on their forest, it's up to government to represent the people and make sure that, look, if they don't want it, they don't want it. And there's got to be other ways that we can find. But at the same time, we don't want to crush industry here, right? Forestry is a huge, if not the largest employer in the province, whatever industry it is. I think there's 22,000 people work in forestry, directly and indirectly. So you don't want to crush that. But you have to do it in such a way that to make sure that there's alternatives to glyphosate spraying, like silviculture, that can help mitigate some of the loss. Now they say, it's going to cost more for silviculture than it does spraying. And look, I agree, that's a hit that's going to have to be taken. But at the end of the day, you've got to balance. The people own the forest, and if the people don't want it, it's up to government to stand up for the people and initiate their concerns.
All right. Now, having to do with outside contracts, the province has on several occasions awarded major contracts to companies from outside of the province. Now, your party is calling for an end to this when New Brunswick has options for these things already. Why do you think our businesses are never top priority?
I've got a lot of concerns when it comes to we've talked a lot in the past about corporate welfare.
Yeah.
Giving money to places like TD Bank and Sears and all this sort of thing. I mean, I oppose that. What I would like to see is the money that is given out to those corporations is to take that money and reduce taxes so that the businesses that are here are not paying the taxes that they're paying now. And not only does it help the businesses that are here, but it makes New Brunswick, if it had lower taxes and a different tax structure in this province, other businesses may want to come here and set up. So you're going to see some economic growth. I met with the Real Estate Association here last week. They talked about the double tax. And there are developers in this province that have packed up and literally left New Brunswick because they will not build another building, another apartment building in this province with the tax structure that we have. And as a result, you've got people that can't find apartments. They can't find places to live. And it contributes in some small way to homelessness, because if you have low taxes and even if you froze apartment rental rates for, say, a period of 3 years so that the double tax trickles down to the tenants so that the landlord's not taking all of the money, but that it falls down. Eventually, what will happen after 3 years, the market will correct itself and you'll have some competition among landlords and developers so that the price of rent will go down, more places will be available because developers will come back into the province. So there's all kinds of benefits to having a reasonable tax structure. But what we have in New Brunswick is completely unreasonable. It's the reason people won't come here, and it's the reason why people are leaving.
Now, would you say that government should give a weighted advantage to local businesses?
Well, I think the weighted advantage is to have a different tax structure. Make sure that all businesses in New Brunswick are paying lower taxes. That's the advantage. I mean, we're losing people in this province by the planeful. They're going to work out west. And I talk to people all the time that say, they're qualified, they have years of experience, and even due to language requirements, they're not fully bilingual. So what do? They leave. They go to Alberta. They work in the healthcare system out there. They work at government services out there because of our ridiculous language laws, they won't work here. So you take that issue, you take taxes, you take lack of opportunity. It's a spiral effect. So all combined, New Brunswick's in a very precarious situation, and that's why I keep saying you can't tinker your way out of this. You have to make bold moves, and that's the only way we're going to see success in New Brunswick.
So now, is there a danger that should local contracts be prioritized no matter what, that local builders will start to jack up the prices knowing that they will get it as a us versus an outside competitor kind of bidding situation going on?
Well, you've got interprovincial trade laws, right, that is there so that provinces can compete in other provinces. But those trade laws have got to be balanced. In other words, what really annoys me is when I hear of local contractors, local businesses, losing tenders to the provincial government while a Quebec company is coming in, getting those tenders and bringing their workers in. I talked to one gentleman who runs a very successful petroleum business, and he's told me, many times that they're giving licenses to petroleum contractors outside of the province, and in many ways bypassing the very policies that are in place in this province, while our local guys are losing the bids. They're losing the contracts because of it. And sometimes the bids are within like 10 to 15%. So it's very, very low. So I think the interprovincial trade laws have to be looked at to make sure that they are fair and balanced, and that we can see some advantage here in New Brunswick.
Now, would there be a danger of outside bidders creating shell companies in the province to bid on their behalf, still moving the money outside of the province itself?
Well, I'm sure that is always there, but that's up to government to make sure that doesn't happen. And again, that gets back to regulation. I mean, government regulates things all the time, but it's got to be reasonable regulation. I mean, we have regulations in this province we refer to as red tape, which small businesses are choking under the red tape. So in one area, we need to deregulate and make it more open for businesses to flourish. But in other areas, like when we talk about outside contractors coming in from out of province, I have no problem with having that highly regulated to make sure, again, that we give some advantage to New Brunswick businesses. Over and over again, I hear this repeatedly since I've been in government, and even before I get in government. We get emails, we have meetings with businesses locally that are saying, look, we bid, we put in a competitive offer, and we lost over some technicality or some foolish regulation that's in there that basically cut them off from the bid. So, yeah, it's got to change.
Now, going off that for now, going to mandatory vaccinations, there's been recent push by Education Minister Dominic Carty to make vaccinations mandatory for school attendance and those that can safely get them. Do you agree with that?
I don't know. I got to be honest. I'm highly torn on this issue. Here's the problem with the bill. Mm-hmm. First of all, neither the Chief Medical Officer of New Brunswick nor the Chief Medical Officer of Canada will come out and fully endorse the bill. They're neutral at best, and I believe that the federal Chief Medical Officer was actually a little less than neutral. She came out and I from what I understood, basically said the bill isn't going to produce what it wants to produce. So the idea, and I understand the minister's initiative on this. I don't criticize his heart in putting the bill forward. He wants to make sure kids are healthy and safe in schools. But my question is will this bill produce what it's supposed to produce? And you got to think about it. My biggest concern is that you're taking away from the rights of parents to how they choose to parent their children. There's some parents out there, there's not a lot, but there's some parents out there that for whatever reason, they don't want their children vaccinated. Now, I'm vaccinated. My kids are vaccinated. They'll continue to be vaccinated because I believe in the science behind vaccinations. But should I, as a government, have the right to tell a parent, you have to vaccinate your kids too? I think government's overstepping its bounds in that area. And that's why the education system highly encourages vaccinations, which is what they should do. They should inform the public on the benefits of the vaccinations. But I'm really struggling with government forcing parents to vaccinate their kids.
Now, if vaccines are not mandatory for school attendance, how do we increase the number of childhood vaccinations, give us more breathing room when it comes to herd immunity, though? Mm-hmm.
Well, again, I think it's about making sure the accurate information is out there. And I know there's some fear among government about, these anti-vaccination movements that are creeping up a lot. But, when I talk to the vast majority of people, they realize vaccinations are important. They realize that they create healthier environments in terms of not, getting these diseases and that sort of thing. I mean, they're all but proven to do that over time. And again, that's why I vaccinate. My kids are vaccinated. But I have a real hard time with government forcing some parents to do that. And then my question is, okay, let's say we make every child in the school system get vaccinated. Who's next? Teachers, volunteers, janitors, cafeteria workers. And then once we do that, well, where do we stop? I mean, government forcing parents and citizens to do things like this, to me, just violates what government should be doing. I think it's overstepping their bounds. But again, I'm torn on this issue, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do at this point.
All right. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight, so thanks for ending it on that. I'd like to thank Kris Austin for joining us tonight. Kris Austin is the leader of the People's Alliance for New Brunswick. Thank you for coming in tonight.
Thank you. Good talking to you.
I'm your host, Troy Glover. We covered a variety of topics tonight. I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight, and I'd like you all to have a good night.